Thank you so much, everybody, and welcome for joining us today in what it is our very first thematic deep dive from OGP Local on a series of topics. Some of these topics are priority topics for us, OGP, but also are topics that have quite important relationship to local governments, because it is a lot of the work that we see local governments being attentive to, such as citizen participation, such as gender and inclusion, and some other aspects. Let me introduce myself before we start. So I am José Marín. I am the lead of OGP local program, and I am very excited to be able to see some familiar faces as well from our local members, but also some dear colleagues and friends of ours that are going to be presenting in this deep dive today. So as I get started, first of all, let me just jump ahead to Wordly. So we have interpretation today for you all. So this is how we're going to be using interpretation. First of all, you can use your mobile phone to be able to get interpretation. The way in which you use it is, please, using your phone, scan the QR code that you see on your screen right now. With that code on your telephone, on your mobile phone, you should be able to get some captions or to be able to hear through audio a translation. Once you click on the QR code, make sure that you select the language that you want to listen to, and then you can enjoy this webinar in your language, either through reading them or through this audio. Do check on your chat, as we have put there the links to be able to hear also the interpretation through the computer as well. Actually, you can read the captions. We'll give you 1 second. We have the link. Yeah, we have the link. Excellent. It's very nice to see you all. And let me go back to the previous slide. So please do introduce yourself. I've seen you've been doing on the chat. If you can, please turn on your cameras. Seeing each other is going to make this a more interesting session. Since the COVID, we all spend a lot of time on Zoom meetings and not necessarily seeing each other's faces. And it's always good to see who is across the computer. You all have your mics muted at this moment, but please use your chat to be able to ask your questions. We are going to have a couple of instances where we can hear your questions. So please make sure to use that and participate. Stay focused, take your notes, and contribute. Along the presentation, you'll see at the bottom corner, you can activate that translation if you haven't done so already, so don't worry about that. Also, to let you know that today's webinar is going to be recorded for learning purposes. And as I said, please use the chat for any questions that you might want to be sharing with the rest of us. Good. We're going to be starting today with public participation, which is a webinar that's going to look at and give you inspiration about the different ways in which local governments can foster public participation as part of their open government strategies. Now, public participation is near and dear to OGP Local. Just in the past couple of years, we've seen that over half of all commitments that OGP Local members have made have a citizen participation component of it. Even more so, for the last 2 years, at least 1/3 of all action plans have included some sort of commitment relating to mainstreaming participation. That means making participation common practice within the administrations. So as you see, it is a very important area for local governments. Not surprising, we all know local governments are closest to the citizens that they serve. That means that that chain link and that opportunity to be able to gather their feedback, to make sure that they are able to express their interest in the different policy areas is much more pronounced. Now, I have a lineup here, a stellar lineup of experts on citizen participation. But first, we want to see how expert are you on this topic? And we're going to have a quick poll to hear from you and see how expert are you on this topic. So right now, we have a poll. And I'd ask you to please provide your answer. First question says, what is your level of expertise on the subject of public participation? And you have a couple of options there. We're going to see what are the answers. You can say you're a master Jedi. You're not a master, but you're quite confident on the topic. You've heard about citizen participation, not sure what it is though, or you don't have a clue about what this is. The second question asks, do you implement participation mechanisms in your day-to-day work? How often? Very often, sometimes, or never. While you are answering those two questions for the poll, and then I'll come back to them a little bit in a couple seconds, just to let you know then as well about the agenda today. So we've put some thought into the design of these webinars to be able to give you two things. One, a brief overview of the topic in of itself. And for this, we're going to have a keynote speaker and an opportunity to hear some of your questions about the topic of citizen participation as it pertains particularly to local governments. Then we're going to go into the panel, which is where we're going to be listening to and taking a little bit of a deeper dive into some subtopics within the broader topic. Now, today we're going to be talking about participatory policymaking as one important or very quite common approach to citizen participation. We're going to be hearing as well about deliberative democracy or deliberative processes of citizen participation, and we're going to finalize by looking at the digital participation methods. Afterwards, we will have another chance for you all to pose some of your questions. So please use the chat for that. We'll be collecting those questions as the presentations are being made. So make sure to use the chat. And afterwards, we're going to talk a little bit about the Open Gov Challenge. As you know, that's we launched the Open Gov Challenge as part of the 2023 strategy. OGP did. And it's a great opportunity to be able to show and to be able to move that needle forward in terms of ambition around open government, particularly on citizen participation. And then the last part is we're going to be talking about some opportunities that they might be for us, for all of you to be able to share some of your knowledge, expertise, and also get some support. Now, before moving forward, let's look at what are some of the results of the survey. Give me 1 second. And the poll. So you can see now the results of the poll. 56% of you are not a master's but confident. We have 17%, which is a pretty good number, that are Jedi Masters. And of course, we don't have anybody that doesn't have a clue about what open government, about what citizen participation is, which is a good thing. And just over half of you, 51%, implement participation mechanisms in your day-to-day work. 40% sometimes, and just 8% never. Good. Thank you for those great answers. Now let's move forward with the slides. There we go. Here you can see our stellar lineup, and I will be introducing them one by one. First of all, we have a dear colleague, Tim Hughes. Give me 1 second. Try to move some things around here. Tim Hughes is leading our work on citizen participation and OGP, and he's focused on deepening OGP's work around strengthening and reimagining democracy through open government, especially through innovative approaches and participation. So we're very lucky today to have him as our keynote speaker. So without further ado, Tim, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jose Maria, and fantastic to join you all today. Great to see some familiar faces, and then also lots of new people I've not met on the call, and great that we've got a mix of different levels of experience on the call as well. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about why might we want to involve people in decision making? Why is public participation important? And I guess particularly at this moment in time as well. So here on this slide, you'll see a few reasons that I've listed. There's a kind of ... deliberately at the end there, but I'm sure you'll have your own as well. So you might want to share those in the chat as I'm talking through these. But I think one kind of important place to start with this is acknowledging that as policymakers, as decision makers in governments, we often have quite kind of partial information about different issues. And to really fully understand and get kind of access to the full range of kind of information, knowledge, and different experiences that we might need to make good policy making, good decision making, involving people in that process is incredibly important. And that can be anybody from kind of technical experts right through to members of the public as well, who bring their own lived experience around different issues. So the first point there is really about accessing those kind of different sources of information, knowledge, and experiences that the public can bring to decision making. Secondly, it can be really important for understanding where public opinion is and kind of where public judgments are on different topics. And I make the distinction there between opinion and judgments, because some forms of participation, as we'll get onto in a bit, are about people's immediate reactions to an issue. Others are about people's, I guess, more considered judgments after they've had a bit of time to consider it, maybe discuss it with other people and consider different sources of evidence. So understanding public opinion and judgments can be incredibly helpful for then informing, again, good quality policy making. Improving the quality of decision making as well. So this kind of links to the first two. But we also know from the evidence that having more diverse groups of people involved in decision making typically leads to better decisions as well. So the more that we can open up these decisions to people, the better they tend to be. Then this next point on providing scrutiny and accountability. Often I like to think of participation as the link between transparency and accountability, which is particularly important within a lot of our work on open governance. So for kind of new information, data to really make a difference, we know that people have to do something with it, and they have to kind of take action, and that therefore can then drive accountability, and particularly where the public is involved in scrutinising decision makers and looking at the quality of public services and things like that. The next point is around strengthening democratic legitimacy and building trust. I think this is often better considered as a like a secondary outcome in a sense. The goal is often the first ones that I've talked through. But a nice kind of happy side effects of public participation tends to be that it builds democratic legitimacy as well, and also builds public trust in decision makers. Then building relationships and ownership and kind of social capital. We know participation can be incredibly important for building connections between people. Stimulating active citizenship is a key way to get people involved and actually taking action around different issues, which can really help to unlock some of the big challenges that we face at the moment, things like climate change, where we need people to kind of actively participate in addressing the issues there. And finally, on my list, it's a democratic right as well. And that's, I guess, an important kind of more normative thing not to forget, that actually people being involved in decisions that affect them is an important democratic right as well. I'm sure you might have others, so do please share them in the chat. But this is just give a sense that there's a whole variety of different reasons why we might want to involve people, and why public participation is so important. But when it comes on to thinking about what public participation is in practice, there's quite a lot of different flavors and different kind of types of participation, I guess, with their own historical and own, I guess, philosophical underpinnings as well. And so there's a few kind of broad categories I've put here on this slide that you may have come across before. So the first one I'll turn to is direct. Well, often we call it kind of direct democracy or direct forms of participation. And here the focus is on giving people the power to decide for themselves on different issues. Then there are participatory forms of public participation, where the focus is more on giving people opportunities to get involved in different issues that impact on them. And here, there's a whole kind of historical development of participatory democracy, which also applies to the workplace and to education and other fields as well as policy making and decision making. And then there's deliberative forms of participation, which are in some ways perhaps a bit newer, where the focus is really on the on the quality of the discourse. So how well do different forms of participation give people the opportunity to discuss and debate issues between themselves? So then we can think about actually where different methods and tools might fit within this. So I think one of the really exciting things around public participation for me is there is just an infinite world of possibilities in terms of different tools, different methods, different ways of engaging people in different ways for different outcomes. Broadly speaking, there's kind of a group of things like referendums, citizens' initiatives, town meetings in the US, which have historically been about direct democracy or direct participation. So those are kind of methods that give power to people to make decisions themselves. Then there are these kind of more participatory forms of methods, and some of these kind of sit on the boundaries. So participatory budgeting, I'd argue, has a bit of direct democracy in it, a bit of participatory democracy in it as well. But these things like expert groups or service co-design, citizen monitoring, even things like public consultations are about kind of maximizing the opportunities for people to be able to have a say on things that impact on them. And then when we turn to kind of deliberative forms of participation, there are these specific methods like citizens' juries, citizen assemblies, public dialogues, and I think community conversations kind of sit a bit on the boundary of deliberative and participatory. But there again, specific kind of methods that are more geared towards giving people the opportunity to discuss issues, to kind of understand them, and to reach kind of informed opinions and kind of judgments on them, and kind of making their own recommendations. Then, of course, online and offline is something that kind of applies across all of this. In a way, I wouldn't see that as a different form of participation. It's something that applies across each of these different types of participation. So all of these, to some extent, can be done online, and all to some extent offline as well. So just to finish off with some recent trends before we turn our attention to kind of what's in the future as well. So I think some interesting things that have happened around public participation in the past few years, and I think we'll hear a bit more about this from some of the speakers later. The first is the deliberative wave, where there's been, over the last 7 or 8 years now, probably, a real growth in a number of things like citizens' juries and citizen assemblies that are being run, particularly at the local level and particularly on topics like climate change. And at least to begin with, starting mostly in Europe, but now we're seeing them pop up all around the world, in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa as well. So that's certainly been a feature of the last few years, this real kind of focus on deliberation and these sorts of methods. But also alongside that, and I think helped along by COVID, is digital increasingly becoming more of the default for how participation happens. And of course, this is different in different contexts and not always the case. But we are seeing digital more and more kind of feature in public participation, and perhaps in a more embedded way than we did in the past, where there might have been a digital kind of app or something developed, but not necessarily well integrated into decision making. The next one, though, I guess, is where we're seeing some of the challenges. So there's been a huge amount of innovation over the past few years in different forms of public participation. But we are seeing some issues with the impacts of those. So we do see good impact in places, but in other places, there have been issues around these kind of methods, these mechanisms not really being properly embedded in how decisions are being made, so not really having the impact on decision making that we'd like to see. And finally, another issue that we're seeing and have been seeing for the last 10 years or so now is the threat to civic space as well. And civic space, so the ability for people to organise, to assemble, to be able to form community associations, civil society organisations, is such an important underpinning to any form of public participation. And in many countries, we are seeing things like the right to protest, for example, being threatened. So this does start to undermine some of the space for public participation as well. So something we need to keep our eye on and try to address. But so just then turning our attention to the future and what's next. So we are already seeing the use of artificial intelligence for participation, and I expect that will happen much more. We're seeing this kind of turn from one-off processes to more enhanced rights and more kind of focus on embedding and mainstreaming participation. And we will, I think we'll discuss that a bit more later as well. And then finally, hopefully on this one, we're seeing more of a turn from these kind of single methods of participation to much more of a focus on different kind of ecosystems and bringing together different methods of participation. So I will finish there and hand back to you, Jose Maria.
Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate it. Thanks for that very succinct but powerful summary around citizen participation overall. We have now some time for some questions, and I've already seen two coming in. One, Tim from Stephen Buckley, that asked, where does today meeting fall? I'm not sure whether Stephen meant this meeting in terms of the participation Venn diagram. But if you were talking more about where can you see that recording, you can check on the chat. We will have the recordings made available. Matilde also asked a question that says, do you feel that with the riding the wave, the public participation process are truly thought out, or do they tend to be superficial in their application? Tim, do you want to start on that? And then we can capture some more questions on the chat.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question around whether these processes are kind of truly kind of thought out or not. And I think there is a real danger with a particular focus or a particular enthusiasm around different methods. So as we've seen recently with things like citizen assemblies, that they become, in a sense, the only game in town, and people want to run a participation process and want to run a citizen assembly because it's a citizen assembly, rather than it necessarily being the best method or tool that fits what they need, I guess, what their purpose is, why they're trying to engage people, who they're trying to engage. So the advice I always give to people is you've got to develop this from the other end. You've got to think around the purpose and the objectives for participation first. You've got to then think about who needs to be involved in order to achieve those purposes. You've got to think about your own internal and external context as well, and what that means for the different kind of ways that you might engage people. And then all of that can help you to decide which method or tool fits best and helps to kind of overcome this sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to kind of to go for the tool or method that's maybe the most kind of well-known or the kind of the sexy thing at that point in time. So so that's a really good question. In terms of where this meeting sits in, I guess, in the Venn diagram. So, well, I think for the purpose of today, we're interested in all of these different forms of participation, or at least I am. And I guess this sort of meeting would probably fit within somewhere between a participatory and deliberative. It is kind of an open opportunity for people to engage in different ways. There's a bit of dialogue and discourse in there as well. So yeah, it's probably a bit of a mix of the two.
Also, maybe a little bit of that expert groups in so many of our audience here has expertise on the topic as well in terms of implementation. Good. So let's keep moving along. Thank you for the questions. If you have some more questions, please put them in the chat. I think it's valuable to be able to see, this broad range of different mechanisms. And as Tim just mentioned, I think what's important is to be able to select that right approach for that goal that's being trying to achieve. Now, we are going to be looking at 3 different approaches. We've selected these because we have seen that it is quite interesting how we've seen these come up over and over again, and as well as being quite ambitious within our local government. So we will be heading over to our first one, which is around participatory policy making. I see a question from Susana. So maybe before we go to that, Tim, if you could prepare a quick answer before we move forward. But yeah, just as I was saying, the next topic is going to be going a little bit more into depth on participation in policymaking, which is something that we see quite often within commitments of action plans of our local members. Tim, I'll head back to you before going back to our next speaker.
Yeah, it's a good question, Susanna, and good to see you as well. So I think there's definitely is a danger of any form of participation actually eroding trust as much as it can build it. And I mean, this really comes down to whether it's a genuine form of participation and whether it has actual impact as well. And I mean, as you've probably heard me say this before, one of my kind of mottos around stuff like this is bad participation is worse than no participation at all. You can do just as much damage in terms of eroding public trust, eroding democratic legitimacy, all of the good things I mentioned earlier. If you don't do it for genuine reasons, and if you don't do it with the intention of having impacts on decision making, then you risk kind of doing more damage. I think that certainly applies with some of the excitement around particularly innovative methods, but it also applies equally to things like public consultation and some of the standard ways that government engages people which can often be quite superficial and often done to kind of tick a box to say a government is consulted, but not really for genuine reasons. So I think across any form of participation, doing it for the right reasons and doing it with views to it having an impact is all important.
Great. And before we go on the what's next, Alexandro asks whether the third and second points are based on evidence in the global practice, literature, participation. Where do you see these as coming from in terms of next steps?
So on the second of these, I think we'll talk about it a little bit more later, particularly in the context of the Open Gov challenge on public participation. But I think because of some of the challenges we're seeing around like one-off public participation processes that aren't necessarily leading anywhere, there's much more interest now in looking at different ways to embed, to mainstream, to institutionalize participation within government. And it's still very early days on this, but some interesting practice that's cropping up, including probably in many of the places on the call today. So there I think there is interesting kind of evidence and practice emerging, but yeah, it's still early days. This kind of move from kind of a single method focus to participatory ecosystems. Again, it's kind of early days. I'd point you towards a really good paper on this by Josh Lerner from People Powers, which was published a month or so back, which gives a really good kind of overview of this, but also some particular other things to look at. I think kind of deliberative systems theory is a really interesting way of actually thinking about the whole system of how democracy works and how you might need to plug in different forms of participation and deliberation to make the whole system more deliberative in that case. And then also things like collective intelligence, which start to pair public participation with big data and AI and open data, things like that, can also create, I guess, more of a kind of an ecosystem and more of a, I guess, a strategic approach, to how we're using public participation.
Super, Tim, thanks. There's another question here, but I'll let you answer on the chat if you want. I would just say to this previous question about, the next steps, I think that's also one of the ambitions that we have as the Open Government Partnership, as a global movement, where we're seeing that focusing on, rights, capacity, and culture change, as well as developing that participatory ecosystem, it's part of what we think is going to move the needle in terms of just making better public policies, right? But also at the same time mitigating some of those risks that Tim just mentioned in terms of just doing something one-off without really, developing that, let's say, that infrastructure to be able to know what are the participatory mechanisms available and know when to use them at the right time, right? And that requires more of an ecosystem and having a good understanding about, where and when should these mechanisms be applied to be able to make sure that they are useful and impactful in the long run. So Edgar, Tim's going to answer your questions online, but let's keep this moving. So next, we're going to be talking about participatory policymaking, and Tim just mentioned people powered, and we are very happy to have Maria Lucien. They are an expert and practitioner on citizen participation, particularly also on deliberative mechanisms. And they're going to be talking to us a little bit more about what does participatory policymaking look like with some examples, and also maybe some support opportunities by people powered. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jose. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to OGP for having me. It's so great to be here with you all. I'm just going to be doing a really quick tour of what participatory policymaking is and what it can look like. But first off, my name is Maria Lucien. I work at People Powered, and we are a global hub working to expand participatory democracy by supporting organizations and governments who are also working on participatory democracy around the world. So first off, what is participatory policymaking? So the simple answer is through the process of participatory policymaking, residents propose, debate, and vote on new policies and policy changes. Though you'll see in a minute, these stages don't necessarily have to be so linear. But at People Powered, we roughly categorize participatory policymaking programs into 4 different types. And the first and broadest category is consultations. And what I mean by broad is that consultations can be formulated in many different ways, but what is specific to consultations is that comments and feedback are usually on predefined questions or problems that government poses to the public. But some consultations can also invite proposals or ideas on specific topics. Now, in citizens' initiatives, citizens can actually present ideas and campaign for support or signatures to endorse their ideas. And there's also usually a commitment for authorities to act on the initiatives with the most signatures or that reach a certain threshold of signatures. Debates, on the other hand, involve structured discussions where citizens deliberate together on key policy issues before decisions are made. And the emphasis is kind of on the exchanges among participants to reach better decisions. So some debates might be about getting consensus or understanding where the consensus is on polarizing issues, and others might be about contributing collaboratively to the drafting of a new policy. And finally, in audits, citizens are asked to provide information on the performance of a public policy or public service based on their lived experience of that service or policy. So it can be used as a standalone process, but it's really more used as the final monitoring and evaluation stage of a broader participatory program. So just to show you what some of this might look like, I've got 3 examples lined up. So the first one is from Leuven in Belgium. And the city government decided to run a participatory process on a digital platform to involve citizens and stakeholders in the preparation of their 2020 to 2025 strategic plan. So they first collected ideas from over 3,000 citizens through their online platform, as well as through the post. And they received over 2,000 ideas in just 1 month of idea collection. And then they did their feasibility studies on these ideas and gave feedback on 96% of them. So 373 of these ideas ended up being included in the final multi-annual plan. And as of 2021, 25 of these had already been implemented, 102 were in progress, and 248 had been planned to be rolled out over the next few years. So these ideas included stuff like safer bike lanes, game libraries, even outdoor fitness spaces. Now, the second one is, and forgive my pronunciation, but the Plan de Futuro in the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. So this was a recent initiative that was launched in 2021 that was aiming to get citizens and governments to think together about the city in a post-pandemic context. So this combined an online consultation stage. So citizens were asked to prioritize 2 ideas per key policy area, and these policy areas covered stuff like well-being or education. And then they also had face-to-face and synchronous digital ideation meetings. So they called them ideathons. And these were to develop the prioritized ideas and transform them into projects. And then these projects were sent to a final voting stage after the government determined what was and wasn't feasible. So during this phase, they received over 10,000 responses from just over 5,000 users. And from the ideation meetings, 135 ideas ended up being sent to a voting phase. Now, the last one is from Madrid. The city council used an online platform that they called Decide Madrid to collect ideas and proposals from citizens. So citizens could propose new laws, vote to prioritize proposals, and finally, proposals that received support from at least 1% of the census population were sent to a voting phase. And then there was like an online debate on the selected initiatives before people voted for or against. But even proposals that got majority support still had to go through the usual process of revision by the city council, feasibility and evaluation. And then they got approved. And if the council decided not to approve them, they either had to draft an alternative proposal or publish their rationale for not implementing them. And since the platform launched in 2015, it's had over 500,000 users registered. They ran over 4,000 debates and over 130 public consultation processes. And in that time, around 500 projects proposed by citizens have been implemented. So the main idea is that these processes might be able to be categorized into these 4 different types, but ultimately participatory policymaking is a really flexible and adaptable methodology. And you can use a variety of different participation activities depending on what's feasible or relevant for you. So the real question when you're designing one of these is what activities you want citizens to participate in. You know, are they going to be proposing or submitting ideas? Are they going to be getting signatures and endorsements for these ideas? Are they going to be deliberating on information together or with authorities and discussing collective solutions? Are they going to be voting on these ideas? And finally, will they be involved in evaluating and monitoring the implementation of these projects? So a participatory policymaking program can involve any of these stages in any configurations. So if you're trying to better understand an issue you don't have a lot of information on, you might want to collect new ideas. If the topic is controversial, then you might want to include like a debate or some kind of discussion element. The great thing about it is it can be done in so many different ways on like a range of different scales. And you might have noticed from the examples as well, they're very well suited to digital platforms, but they can be done in person as well, or even as a combination of online and in-person activities. So taking that step into the world of participatory policymaking is really exciting because it's so modular. It leaves so much room for experimentation and flexibility. You can start with a small consultation with civil society or stakeholders and scale it up from there, or you can start with an open call for submissions, even carry on a new process using outcomes or ideas generated from a previous process. So I encourage you to be very creative with that when you're taking this step. And on that note, we offer a lot of resources and programs to support you on this journey at People Powered. We offer a few different accelerator programs with comprehensive training, peer learning, and mentorship to regular cohorts of governments and organizations to help them launch and improve participatory programs. But we also have a peer mentorship program called Rising Stars that can match people who want to launch programs or improve programs with experts who can provide direct support. We also have a range of resources like our online resource center that compiles case studies, guides, and other resources on participatory democracy, as well as the participation playbook, which is an online interactive process building tool. And yes, you can use it to build a participatory policymaking process. I'm going to put all of these links in chat so you can have a look, but please feel free to reach out if you're interested, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction. So thanks everyone for your time. I'm going to end it there. And I'll pass it back to you, Jose.
Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. With good concrete examples, great explanations about the different subcategories of participatory policymaking that you can think of. And also thanks a lot for sharing those resources. I can highly recommend the mentorship programs that you have. Some of our local members have been part of it as well, and the accelerators. So do take a look, because if you are thinking about developing a new commitment around around citizen participation as part of your action plan, or even outside of your action plan, great resources, great support for all of you to have. And if I am correct, I think the window for applications for the Rising Star membership is open. I think, Maria, you mentioned that as well. Excellent, great. We have a couple of questions, and I saw a hand up. We are going to continue. We're going to collect them until the very end. So please do put your questions on the chat, and later on we can try to open up to all of you. So apologies for those who raised their hand, and I kindly ask for your patience. Now, we were talking about this deliberative wave, the new hot item on the citizen participation practices. And to talk a little bit more about that, we have a dear colleague, Mauricio Mejia. He leads the work on citizen participation. He's an advocate for open government, for digital rights, all around superstar at the OECD and good friend of OGP in general. And Mauricio, I would like to hand it off to you so you can tell us more about all what's going on with the wave and how we can catch it.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jose, Clorinda, and the team. Thank you for the invitation. Always a pleasure to be part of the OGP club. Nice to see some familiar faces, and very nice to meet you all. Very quickly, so my name is Mauricio. I work at the OECD, and I'll be briefly explaining the work we have been doing on deliberative democracy, the trends we've collected
I think Mauricio is having some online connectivity issues. So hopefully he'll come back in 1 second. Or while we wait, I was thinking of maybe addressing one of the questions that came up. Oh yeah, Mauricio. Okay, let's do the following. Let us go to another all-round superstar of citizen participation with Katya, and then we'll come back to Mauricio. How about that? So Katya, she is founder, international director of the Participation Factory, organization working hand in hand with many, many local governments on implementing all the different civic citizen participation initiatives. And she's going to be talking to us about digital participation. So as you heard from Maria and Tim, digital is a big player now, particularly after COVID. I think most everything happens digitally in relation to meetings and all that, which opens very interesting opportunities, but also has some drawbacks. So Katya, if you please.
Perfect. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction, and thank you for the fellow speakers for laying the ground for my presentation. Indeed, I think nowadays it's unavoidable to talk about digital. I mean, we're having a meeting digitally, we live digitally and work digitally. So let's dive into the conversation about the digital participation specifically. And well, first of all, let's quickly discuss why we do digital participation, like what are exactly the benefits or what kind of things that are pushing us to do it. And as it has already been mentioned multiple times, it's very much in line with the current habits and culture of our life and of our work. So it's only natural that it becomes a part of our political life and habits as well. But more so, it is a way to democratize participation because it lowers traditional barriers and opens access to communities and members that are often excluded from political discussions. And it reaches linguistic minorities, people with disabilities who might not be able to get to the physical meetings, and to those who are unable to participate in large in-person events or who might be caregivers and providers who cannot leave the space. So this way, digital participation is a wonderful opportunity to foster inclusivity and to support time-constrained individuals who may lack time or resources to actually participate in conventional methods, such as I already said, caregivers or shift workers. But at this end, also it allows participation in asynchronic matter, so that anyone can do it from the comfort of their home and from the comfort of whatever time they're willing to dedicate to participation. It also helps to facilitate multilingual participation. Again, I'm sure we've all experienced workshops where unfortunately translator wasn't available, and we see now that we have an automatic translation available for our meeting. So a lot of platforms and civic processes that happen online can actually happen in various languages by offering translations, and especially automatic translations are incredibly important right now because it decreases costs for translation. And finally, it helps to efficiently use the resources. As you can already gather from everything that I said, digital participation can help save time and money in terms of organizing the meetings, in terms of additional costs associated with actually holding the meetings in particular spaces. And so the benefit lies in both for organizers and the participants who do not have to invest those additional costs into participation. And when it comes to the digital participation ecosystem, I'll be talking specifically about civic tech. And then again, I'll highlight that civic tech is something that is defined differently in different contexts. So in case of Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe as well, by civic tech, we mean participation technology that facilitates new channels of exchange between the government and the citizen. So, for example, such platforms facilitate already existing processes or digitizes already existing processes, like, for example, issuing of a driver's license online or applying for a birth certificate online. That's something that is related to government tech and not necessarily civic tech. Civic tech is really about the exchange of information and creating participation opportunities in an online space. And there are plenty of ways to look into typology of civic tech. There is open source technology where the code is freely available to anyone. There is privately available civic tech that serves as a off-the-shelf type of product that you can purchase and use. And obviously you can build your own. But I think a very useful way of looking in civic tech is what kind of features and functionalities it offers, since it helps you to understand what kind of processes it might be fit for and what kind of projects you can actually run through the civic tech. And so in the very basic layout, obviously there is much more, but in the very basic overview of civic tech, we usually talk about the one that facilitates such features as surveying and polling to collect information on specific preset questions that you already have, which is different from the voting. Surveying polling is there to kind of measure the temperature and not to make a final decision. Data that comes out from surveying polling is then interpreted and used by the decision makers and organizers. On the contrary, voting is a decision-making process, and usually voting requires much higher levels of cybersecurity and verification in order to ensure that people who actually vote are the right people. And you will notice that the civic tech tools that focus on voting usually have much more options connected to authentication of users in comparison with other civic tech tools. Then we have the tools that gather feedback either in the form of comments or proposals and suggestions, basically collecting information from people in a written form. Again, as I said, very straightforward feature. I will show you a few screenshots of different tools that you will see. We also see quite a lot of tools that are utilizing maps and the map-based solutions for both gathering feedback, surveying, polling, doing everything. I think the beauty of the mapping tools, and again, in a second, I'll show you in the screenshot, is that they're very visual and it's quite easy for anyone and for participants and organizers alike to actually interpret the data that comes out of it and to also track the data and the progress on how this data is being worked on. And finally, the two last features and typologies of tech, the very basic one feature that is probably exists in pretty much every single tech, and it's a very basic type of participation, is informing or information sharing. You do need to make sure that people actually have access to information that they need in order to participate in a meaningful way. So that feature is quite important. And the very last one is co-creation, or the type of tech that allows participants not only to give the feedback and provide suggestions for solutions or projects, but allows people to actually meaningfully cooperate through the platform and co-develop and co-design specific solutions. So when it comes to the examples, as I already mentioned, I'm not going to go through a lot. I just wanted to show a few interesting ones that I think are striking in the way that how they work, and they provide some unique type of functionalities. What you see is a tool called Consider It, and it's a tool that can be used for voting or opinion gathering. As you can see, there is a scale on which you can show whether you agree or disagree, or you can actually put anything on those two different ends. It can be two opposite solutions. It can be different emotions if you want to kind of measure the temperature in the community. What is interesting is that it gives a very striking visual representation of how agreeing or disagreeing people are, but also it has a feature of the feed underneath it. So you can actually read the comments and the reasons why people voted one way or the other. So you get quite a lot of data from this type of a solution. The other one that I like to show is a map-based solution, Fix My Street. It's always fun to see it. The basic idea behind it is that once you get this app on your phone, you can snap a photo, take a video, and put a pin on the map to say there is a problem on the street and it needs to be fixed. It's a great tool, as I said, to start mapping and seeing the areas that might require some special love and care. And obviously, you can also thematically color the map, and you say that we want to show only the issues connected to transportation, only the issues connected to the sewage system, etc. So you get a bit more precise maps. But also what's great is that if you click on each of those pins, you actually get information on when it was submitted and if it has been processed. So you also have this tracking and accountability feature that is built into it. And for the final application, I'm showing Go Vocal. It shows pretty much every single other feature that there is. You can see that there is a functionality for proposing ideas, for voting up and down to support or disapprove of the idea. You can comment on it. And I think what's also great, and quite a few different tools have this functionality or have this feature, they also show you on a map, if you can see those numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, they can show you the flow of the project with an explanation what each stage means, educating people on what the process is about. And it also helps them place themselves in whether they're interested in participating on this stage and what can happen next and how they can engage next and plan further. And as it was mentioned before, all of those are beautiful things that I just mentioned. There are also different risks associated with digital participation that we need to keep in mind. And the very first obvious one is that there is a possibility of exclusion due to digital divide. So basically, in order for someone to use a civic tech tool, digital participation platform, they need to have stable internet connection, they have to have specific hardware and also digital literacy skills. All of those things we take for granted, and oftentimes marginalized and excluded communities actually do struggle with having access to it. So whenever you are thinking about using digital participation, it's always good to think about who is the target audience and who might be potentially excluded by a process if it's done completely online, so that you can understand who the process is going to reach. Also, there are additional costs associated with purchasing the tool, setting it up, and maintenance, which is quite obvious. Even open source tools that you might get for free as a code, you still need to invest some capacities to actually set it up and maintain it and manage it. So you also need to think about the capacities that you might need. Even if it's not open source, you still need someone to take a look at the platform every once in a while and make sure that's up and running as it should, and that the information that comes from the platform reaches the people it needs to reach. And obviously the cybersecurity and privacy concerns have to be taken into account. Again, that's something that we sometimes take lightly, but for the processes, especially decision-making ones, those are quite important points that need to be addressed. And just to wrap things up, I wanted to share a couple of best practices when it comes to the use of civic tech, and hopefully that's going to answer a few questions that I already saw popping up in the chat. So the very first one is when using civic tech, it's always best to create a hybrid process that combines in-person and online component. It's a very counterintuitive suggestion for someone who's speaking about digital participation, but unfortunately, there are certain things that might not be replicated online. There are certain communities that cannot be reached online effectively. So providing them with an opportunity to actually connect to you and be a part of the process in person becomes essential. Then the choice is whether you want to fully duplicate the process in both spaces and have exactly the same flow online and in person, or if you want to have just a segment of the project or program online and do everything else in person. So you have this flexibility. If you opt for the second one, it's necessary to still think about the flow, how the information from in-person meetings and in-person activities is going to flow into an online space and the other way around, so that you don't create two completely disconnected communities, but you actually merge them together for the benefit of both. And lastly, the best practice is to meet people where they're at, meaning that you engage them or reach them through tools they might already widely use. And you can do it for one of the reasons. One, you can actually channel people towards civic tech tools. Let's say you know that your target audiences uses Facebook, and so you use Facebook to actually connect people to your civic tech tool or online platform. Or if there is a case where, again, digital literacy is low and people are not comfortable doing those kind of jumps between different platforms and between different online spaces, sometimes you can just fully engage people without the use of additional civic technology. There are cases where WhatsApp has been effectively used for dissemination of information, voting, ideas gathering, etc. So again, it all really depends on your target audience and what they're comfortable with. So you can obviously also have awareness raising and educational activities on top of this to slowly build the digital literacy skills. But it's a long process. And if you need to do something immediately, it's best to try and combine the best of the two worlds that is available to us. And I think I'll stop here. So I'll pass it back to you, José Maria.
Thank you, Katya. Thank you for that. Do you want to take just 1 second to plug the Civic Tech Report? We just had a quick question about the list, and Maria was kind enough to refer to Civic Tech Report that you guys are publishing very quickly before we move on.
Yeah. So you mean you want me to quickly present the Civic Tech Report?
Well, just let them know that, you know,
yeah.
about the Civic Tech Report, what it is and where they can find it.
So thank you for noticing it. I completely forgot to mention that. Basically, we just published the Civic Tech Market Report for the year 2025. And it practically consists of a few things. One is general expert knowledge base on what civic tech is, what kind of processes it can be used on, and what kind of process for choosing tech should be followed. And the second part, which I'm particularly proud about, we monitored tools that are active in the European market. And we put a selection of catalog of 80 different tools, 80, and mapped every single feature, functionality, case studies to help you actually understand what's available for you and what kind of options, tools you can find in Europe at the moment, but they're active internationally as well. And you can find it at civictechreport.com, or you can reach out directly to me and ask me questions, and we can discuss it further.
Thank you so much. Great. So one other problem with digital is that sometimes it lets you down, but it always comes back, just like Mauricio, who had a little digital issue, but now back on track, to talk to us about that deliberative wave that we were mentioning at the beginning. Mauricio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and apologies for that. I was alone talking to myself, didn't realize I was not in the room anymore. But glad to be back, and so going back to the topic of deliberation and really thanking for the opportunity to be here. I think it was good to start by maybe going a little bit in depth, in detail, to what it's the deliberative process. I'm not sure everybody here knows. So in a nutshell, and I think Tim and Maria also presented the context of it, but in a nutshell, as you can see here, we need first a public authority. So it can be, of course, a local council, it can be a national government, it can be an independent institution, a parliament, a public authority with a public problem. And as we will see later, the problem can be very diverse, but once there's this problem, this public authority conveys a small representative group of everyday people, so what we call the assembly, and how they convey is through a civic lottery, meaning that first they will send randomly selected invitations to households. Houses are randomly allocated depending on, for example, the database of addresses, the electoral list, the phone list. So it depends on the data available for the public authority. And then on this sample, some statistical considerations are selected to ensure that we have a representative sample. So imagine a little bit what's done with some opinion pollings, where some representative samples are created to have a group that looks alike, the closest it can look like the community itself. Then this group, this assembly of people that can go from 30 to 150 to even more, depending on the problem, on the size of the community, is not the same to create a representative sample of a 5,000 community, a town, that a country with millions of people. So it depends a lot. First, they will go with the first phase of orientation and learning. And this is very important because it separates this process from maybe other participatory or deliberative processes where people arrive with their own opinions, but maybe without a proper knowledge or expertise on the topic that is going to be discussed. So in this first phase, it's important that participants hear from experts. It can be scientists, it can be, for example, if we're talking about health, it can be from doctors, from nurses, from also academia, but also private sector, other government representatives. So the idea here is to give a broad perspective, all the possible opinions, for then the members of this assembly to build their own informed judgment about the topic put on to question. Then they come to deliberate. So it's not a discussion like in a bar or with friends. It's actually a certain methodological approach to deliberation with facilitated deliberation to ensure that all voices are heard, but also that they go towards consensus or at least informed. Everybody provides their own informed opinion. Then this group will vote for their main recommendations, which are drafted and presented to the public authority that convey this assembly. In red, you can see that the response is also very important. As mentioned before, providing feedback is important for these cases to show that there are certain respect, but also commitment to the time put by citizens in this process. These type of processes are not a silver bullet. So as Tim was saying, there are different forms within juries with smaller groups of people, but also citizen assemblies, broader conventions with more than 100 people. And they are not silver bullet because they're not apt to solve every problem. They're good to solve these three problems that we see here, especially value dilemmas, complex problems that require trade-offs like infrastructure or budget, and in particular, long-term questions like climate change. And to give you an analysis of the database that we have collected, we have 732 cases from not only OECD countries, but across the world. And as we see, there's been a momentum, but this momentum continues. So more and more public authorities are organizing this type of processes. And the main trends that we have seen is that they're used to solve especially long-term and contentious issues. Environment is the first issue that these processes are being used to address, but also contentious decisions such as strategic planning or urban planning, where trade-offs are required. And in addition, also as raised previously, the existence of these permanent assemblies, meaning not only a one-off experimentation, but something that builds as an institution, are on the rise. And digital, of course, is essential. We saw during COVID-19 a rise of digital deliberations. The digital remains an important aspect, but in 2023, we saw coming back to face-to-face assemblies with a digital component. So for example, 40% of the assemblies that we collected use digital to communicate with the public. with social media, digital platforms, other online consultations, etc. And last but not least, we see also an important rise of remuneration to participants as an important aspect to ensure these processes are inclusive, that everybody can participate at least as much people as possible. If we look at deep dive on the local level, as you can see here, 63% of our cases come from municipal or local levels and 21% from regional levels. So the biggest chunk of the cases that we have collected come from not national, what can be subnational, whether regional, local, depending, of course, on the governance structure of the country. But we see that it's at this level where citizens are more involved in these forms of participation. Another trend that sees that 83% of the institutionalized processes come from local authorities. So there is a willingness to create new forms of permanent deliberation at the local level. Some examples, we have been running different pilots at the European Union at the local level, thanks to the European Commission DG Regio. And for example, in Poland, we are currently testing a citizen jury on train transport in a GMZ metropolis. Interesting here is that we first started with an online consultation to broaden the participation, to understand the problems. And now these problems are going to be addressed by a smaller but representative group of people, specifically on where to put the future stations of a railway in Silesia. And in another example, also on mobility, in the municipality of Ramnico-Vâlcea in Romania, we piloted the first deliberative process in Romania. In this case, it was about how to transfer from private cars to more sustainable mobility, how to convince citizens to find strategies to convince the public to use other forms of transport. In Normandy region in France, we are working rather on the cultural policies. So we are organizing a deliberative process to make citizens contribute to the funding strategy of cultural places in the region from here to 2050. So they're gonna produce orientation wishes that then the region will translate into budgetary orientations. And last but not least, in Spain, in the Basque Country, we helped design a process regarding mental health. So sorry, it's not the slide, it's not correct. It's about mental health, especially on the young people after COVID. And I take also the space to invite you on Monday. We will launch the report that showcases the learnings of this process that can also be inspiring for other regional or local governments. To mention others, and to also point out to good examples in non-OECD countries like Brazil, where there's have been also a very important use of these processes for climate policies. And for example, at the moment, there is 4 assemblies running, one in Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil, regarding the future of climate policies in the region. And a last example that I find interesting is in Brussels, where the local council has invited randomly selected citizens to form mixed committees, meaning half elected representatives, half randomly selected citizens, which also is one of the next frontiers, trying to challenge the way we understand representation, we understand democratic representation by going beyond elected representative, but also thinking about randomly selected citizens that can be you, me, or a neighbor participating in this important exercise. To conclude, I just wanted to show you the different tools, and I'll put it on the chat, but we developed 4 resources on deliberative democracy, one big report with a database that is constantly updated. So we are currently working and release end of this year, the 2024 version, but also some guidelines to implement, to evaluate, and to institutionalize these processes. So that's all on my side. Thank you very much for the space. Happy to respond to any questions. I'll be putting some interesting links in the chat.
Thank you very much, Mauricio, for that. Always very instructive and very interesting to see how the boundary keeps moving forward in terms of challenging that deliberative processes and, you know, the democratic principles that we have accustomed to. Now, talking about pushing it forward, the agenda, pushing forward our ambition, I'd like to invite once again Tim to talk to us a little bit about the Open Gov Challenge. Now, the Open Gov Challenge is something that we just launched about a year ago, so it's not that soon ago. But the idea is to inspire us to commit to ambitious commitments, and one of the areas is citizen participation. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Jose Maria. So this was very much in response to our own public participation process at OGP. So for OGP's 5-year strategy, we ran quite an extensive engagement process with which many of you would have participated in some shape or form. And some of the key things we heard from that is the need for more more ambition on reforms, a need for kind of more focus on some kind of particular topics to help to make progress on those. So as Jose Maria said, we launched the Open Gov Challenge last year to help to respond to that. You will see that there are 10 different challenge areas that cover a lot of different open government topics, including things like access to information and fiscal openness and gender and inclusion. But one of them is focused specifically on public participation. And as we were thinking about where, I guess, where the next frontier in a sense for public participation was, and kind of how OGP could best support the next round of reforms that needs to be made, we really decided to focus in on these issues around mainstreaming, embedding, and institutionalizing participation so it can have a much more impact and happen on a much more regular basis in decision making. So you'll see that the wording of the challenge is to mainstream or embed fit for purpose, high quality, and inclusive public participation practices across key government sectors, processes, and institutions. So through this, we are calling on all OGP members to make progress towards those 10 areas. And we'd love to see some really good reforms being committed to, specifically on the public participation challenge. There are a range of different ways that you can get involved with this. So one is that if your OGP local is developing an OGP action plan soon, then as part of that, you could include a relevant commitment in your action plan and signal that it's addressing the Open Gov challenge, and that will kind of enter it into the Open Gov challenge. OGP members can also make standalone actions and commitments that don't necessarily need to sit within an action plan, specifically in response to any of the 10 challenge areas. So there again, opportunity to make a submission on mainstreaming public participation. And we will also be setting up a new Open Gov Awards program, which the details are currently being worked out at the moment, but there will be opportunity through that as well to make submissions to the Open Gov Challenge. So, and as it says at the bottom here, none of these options are mutually exclusive. So it could be that you introduce something through an action plan and it also gets entered into the Open Gov Awards or vice versa. So yeah, lots of different ways to participate. So in support of the Open Gov Challenge, there are a few different things that we're doing. In the chat in a moment, I'll post a link to the Open Gov Guide, which has a particular chapter on mainstreaming public participation, with lots of examples and guidance documents and things like that can be helpful. But also, coming soon is a new accelerator program that we're working on with People Powered and the Institute for Public Finance in Kenya, called the Mainstream Participation Accelerator. So the idea of this is to support a cohort of around about 20 reformers over a 6-month period, and it will provide kind of hands-on support and training for government and civil society reformers working on this topic of mainstreaming public participation. There'll be a range of different things, including an in-person workshop around kind of March, April time next year. Then opportunity for mentorship, online sessions to discuss different issues related to mainstream participation, training resources and other things as well. with real focus of the members of the program developing their own kind of action-oriented solutions to mainstreaming public participation in their particular context. So thinking about what reforms they could help to achieve through this program. So hopefully this will be of interest to many of you. We will be launching the call for applications at the beginning of October. If you're signed up to any of our kind of social media or our newsletter, then you'll get that when it's launched. But something to be looking out for, and would encourage as many of you to apply for it as possible. Back to you, Jose Maria.
Thank you very much, Tim. And just one question: is the challenge open only to OGP members?
No, it's not. No, it's open to anyone really, as long as you're working on these issues around public participation and kind of mainstreaming, embedding public participation. So yeah, so even if you're not from a OGP local member or even kind of a national OGP member, that doesn't exclude you. You're still very welcome to apply to the program.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this. Now, I do remember that I said at the very beginning that we would have a space for questions and answers. Now, two things have happened. One is we are just on time, and two, thanks for the great involvement of our speakers. Most, if not all, questions have been answered through the chat, which is very good for us. And I also want to thank our speakers for keeping up with the chat, providing all those answers. It is a very interesting read, and we'll find a way to capture that read on the chat with the resources, the answers to the questions, the experiences of everybody, so we can have that accessible to you. So if you have any last minute questions, pop it in the chat. I would kindly ask our speakers to try to address those if you can, while I do a quick recap of what we've seen. So as you know, we heard public participation is not about informing citizens, but making sure that they're involved in the creation of those solutions to some of the public policy problems. There are many, many flavors to citizen participation, and as was discussed, it is important to select the right tool for the job. One of the main challenges that we see, other than some of the risks of the different methods and making sure that those participatory mechanisms are thought through and that the right choice of the tool and the approach is selected for the right moment with the right intentions to make sure that it's effective and it's not wasting the time, the effort, the good intentions both of citizens but public officials. We have this challenge of really mainstreaming and embedding, high quality processes across government sectors, processes, institutions. We aim to see that public participation becomes a toolbox for governments that can be deployed at the right moment and in the right time. And hopefully we can see that tool being used more and more, both most efficiently, but also more often. Now, we just shared with you all. We'll be lucky just to hear from some of our partners. We have many, many more partners that are working in this field. We have People Power, OECD, the Participation Factory, and we have some others. But make sure that you reach out, check out the works that they're doing. They have accelerators, mentorship, toolbox, guides, reports, whole host of information that I'm going to highly recommend for you to access as you're thinking of those commitments that you want to develop, or even that challenge submission that you might want to look into. So we are a large community, so make sure that you sign up to our roundup. Check out what we're doing in our page from OGP Local. Citizen participation will continue to be an important thematic priority for us, and we would like to see some more interesting examples. A quick plug, next week we're going to have another one of these deep dives. We're going to be talking about gender and inclusion. We have a really good lineup as well, so make sure that you sign up to that. Without further ado, then I'll leave you here with some of the links. We'll be sharing the information as well online, the recording, and thanks to everybody. Our speakers, all of you for such great, interesting questions. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the OGP local team, Clora, Ciafat, Mercedes, who've been working round the clock to bring this to you. So hopefully we'll see you next week. And thank you to everybody once again.